All right, can you guys hear me, all of you? Awesome. So we have about 2 minutes left. I'm tired of standing here just awkwardly. So let's have a little fun. How many of you use Chrome? Most of you guys, okay. Just a couple of fun things. This is something I just learned recently. So in Chrome, when you pull up a new tab, and if you do not have internet, remember the thing that comes up, the sad thing that you have no internet connection and there is a little dinosaur? That's a game, right? You guys know that? How do you play that? You cannot turn off Wi-Fi on your computer. That's criminal. So here's what you can do. You can get up here, and you can say about Dino. Yeah. See, now you can play this all day long. How many of you do JavaScript? How many of you write JavaScript? Okay, half the room, good. I do a little bit as well, just enough to be dangerous. But this is a .NET talk, so we can make fun of JavaScript a little bit, right? So let's do this. So every language has quirks, but it seems like JavaScript has like some of the best ones. So this is like a pop quiz for you guys. How about what's an empty array plus? Let's just do an array first. What do you think is an empty array plus an empty array? Empty string. Why not? How about an empty array plus? You can see that I've been playing with this. Plus an empty object. It's an array of object. But how about I flip this? Should be the same, right? If I do an empty object plus an empty array, they should be the same, right? No, it's 0. Okay, you guys know what NaN is in JavaScript? Not a number, right? It should be not a number. So what should be the type of NaN? Yeah, there you go. What should be the type? A string of number. Makes total sense, right? How about is this equals itself? This we kind of know from JavaScript. False, yeah? But is it equals, if I can type, is it equals true? No. Is it equals false? No. I can keep going on. There are websites dedicated to like what they have JavaScript, but all the good stuff. We can keep going on. So it's 9:30. Let's roll. All right. So good morning, officially, and thank you for waking up early and coming out. Welcome again to DevReach. Welcome to day 2. I'm sure all of us are excited. You'll have a busy day. And then at the end of the day, we all get to hang out in an epic after party at the Holiday Inn. So thank you for coming out. We really appreciate the time that you have taken out of your busy life to come and join us here at DevReach. All right, so my name is Sam BASU. I am from the state of Pennsylvania in the US, way up north, almost by Canada. And we have most of our team here, they're from like Florida and Texas, and they said, it's going to be cold in Sofia. We're like, no, it's fine. It's actually really pleasant, except for the rain. It's really nice. So I am a developer advocate, which means I really don't do anything. I just talk about things. I don't have much depth. But we kind of focus on the Telerik side of products. How many of you use Telerik products? OK, some of you guys, great. So if you have any pain points, if you have any questions, please come and talk to us. There are plenty of progress folks around. There is a booth right outside, so come and talk to us. I have plenty of stickers up here, Xamarin and some .NET ones if you want to come and grab after that. This is my Twitter handle. This is my handle for most things social, so if you want to find me after the talk, that's the easiest way to get hold of me. All right, so how many of you, this is a Xamarin talk. How many of you work with Xamarin or have played with Xamarin? OK, so not a whole lot. So this is good. I can go a couple of different ways with this talk. So why don't I try doing this? In an hour, we can try kind of unpacking Xamarin. Like, what's the promise? What can Xamarin do for you? And then we'll look at some tooling. What are some tools of the trade? What are some frameworks that you use? And then we'll try looking at some like real-world apps. We'll look at some UI. We'll look at some code. We'll look at some front-end and back-end stuff and kind of try to wrap things up with everything that a Xamarin developer needs to know to be successful at building Xamarin apps, OK? So let's get rolling. 9:32, all right. So this is my 1-minute spiel before we get into Xamarin on all things mobile. It is almost 2018. We have a month to go, but like nothing happens in December, right? So it is 2018. As developers, it's always good to have choice as to how we build our apps, right? Mobile apps in particular have a lot of choice. And it's important that we spend a little bit of time to pick our technology stack, because this depends a lot on the skills that you have, the type of app you're making, your audience, the code base that you want to maintain going forward. So you do not want to take on something that you're not fond of. You really want to do something that you like, and you want to maintain that going forward. So several ways in which you can do this. These are some of the broad ways. If you have a website, and it's almost 2018, so the lowest hanging fruit is the mobile web, right? So do not make your website something that does not work nicely on a mobile device. I should not have to pinch and zoom, right? There are lots of frameworks that will help you out. That is Twitter Bootstrap, that is Kendo UI, which we make. There are many other open source frameworks that will help you out so your website behaves nicely on a mobile device. You saw Chris Hallman do his keynote yesterday. That's kind of taking mobile web to the other extreme of a progressive web app. You can still do that. The web can act as a good distribution mechanism for mobile apps, but it has a couple of challenges that we can try to getting around. But you can, at the very least, throw a manifest file on your website that will help your website be a nice citizen on mobile devices. People can pin your app to the home screen and so on. If, however, you want to have a store presence, a curated store for, I'm talking about Apple, Google, and Microsoft. So if you have to have a business-to-consumer app and you want to have a store presence, then you need to put your app in the store. And there are, again, several ways in which you can do that. First is native. This is where you kind of get down to the native ecosystems for each platform, and you go build your app. If you have the time and the resources, this is the best thing to do, because you're closest to the metal, you have the best possible experience, but it is hard for a single developer to know all three things, right? Because Apple is all Xcode and Objective-C or Swift. Android is Java. You can have a choice of IDEs. And Windows is mostly C# and XAML. So it's hard for a single guy to know all three. It is harder for enterprises to have three different teams that do the same thing towards a single app, right? So we want to do things that are cross-platform that will help us scale. So how do you do cross-platform? You have a couple of choices. If you're invested in web technologies, I mean, mobile web is the easiest thing to do, but hybrid is the next thing. It is where you use your web skills, your HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and you package up your apps and put them in the store, right? If you do a good enough job, the user should not notice, because you are still rendering your app inside of a giant canvas, a web canvas, a web view, so to speak. Hybrid apps still have sort of a legit play for some line of business apps, but where hybrid apps get a little dinged on is performance, because you are running inside the web shell. It is not truly a native app. So in the last couple of years, you have seen the whole like JavaScript native app concept kind of come to fruition. There are several ways in which you can do this. This is what we make NativeScript. We work with Google to make it work with Angular and TypeScript. So, and you can do React Native from Facebook. The idea is you are writing true JavaScript or true TypeScript, and at runtime, it is truly a native app on each platform. So single code base, but you're writing JavaScript or TypeScript. However, if you are into .NET, how many of you do .NET? OK, so most of the room. So this is perfect for you. If you are doing .NET, I think the ship has almost sailed, because the solution is very easy. And that's Xamarin. I call it cross-compiled because essentially you are writing C#. We'll talk all about it, but you're writing C#, you're writing .NET, and we will compile it down. By we, I mean Xamarin and Microsoft will compile it down into native bits and native apps for each platform, and you're doing it from a single code base. All right, so lots of choices. Play around and find the one that really works for you. We're going to focus entirely on Xamarin, but again, I'm perfectly fond of the other things that you can do. All right, let the Xamarin Love Fest begin. Before we talk about Xamarin, though, this is, again, my 1-minute like .NET big picture slide. I'm sure you guys have seen this from Microsoft. Things are changing. Yeah, this is not your grandma's .NET. This is not your grandpa's tooling. Things are evolving. I mean, you can still stay in Visual Studio and do exactly what you have been doing 5 years back. But if you're open to a little bit of change, there is quite a bit of change. There is not a single .NET anymore. .NET has multiple heads. That is the .NET that we are used to, .NET Framework. That's the full framework on which all your apps run, web, desktop, and mobile. But that's not the only thing. There is .NET Core now. And this thing is about 2.5 to 3 years old. We are at .NET Core 2.0. This is taking some of the pain points of .NET, so to speak, and trying to start from scratch. This is very lean, it's modern, and it's cross-platform for the first time. The CLR runs on Mac and Linux. And then we have other ports of .NET on other platforms. So you guys know of Mono? Mono is a port of .NET from like back in 2002. So it's been around for a long time, for pretty much the history of .NET. And then Xamarin came along and they said, we're going to run Mono, and we're going to compile your apps down and make the runtime available on each platform. So Microsoft in 2016, they acquired Xamarin. And I mean, these are the three main .NETs, but there are other .NETs, like there's a .NET for, there's a port for Unity and so on. So these are base class libraries. So there are three major .NETs now and a few others. So things are coming along, and you choose the .NET that is right for you. This is what allows Microsoft to say, with .NET, with C#, you can target anything, right? So any app platform, web, desktop, mobile, you can do it all. We'll talk about .NET Standards Library and some of these core things, but take a look at the tooling here. This has changed a lot. We used to have just Visual Studio on Windows, which is one of the best IDEs ever. But it's still a beast, because it's been around for like 15 years, and we have built a lot of plugins and rich ecosystems on top. It's a beast to get installed and get started up, right? So they're trying to, again, lower the barrier to entry so that anybody, a college kid with a Mac, can jump in, right? So there is Visual Studio for Mac, which I'll show you. I'm on a Mac today. There is Visual Studio for Code, which is a lightweight cross-platform code editor, works beautifully for ASP.NET, Node.js, Azure, you name it. And then Command Line is back, because Command Line is the only common thing between Windows, Mac, and Linux, right? So they're building up tools that are Command Line first, and then they're giving you a visual way of doing things, okay? So that's .NET. Xamarin, I think, for the .NET developer, truly democratizes mobile development, because you get to use the skills that you already have, and you get to write truly cross-platform mobile apps. So what does Xamarin do for you? What's the promise? I don't need to sell you on the whole thing, but the idea is you get to use C#, XAML, existing tools, existing OS, whatever that you want to bring, it's all good. You have top-notch IDEs, both on Windows, Visual Studio on Windows and on Mac. It behaves almost exactly the same way. The dev experience is exactly the same on Windows versus Mac. And the whole ecosystem is pretty rich. I mean, mobile apps have a whole life cycle to them, right? So you build your app, you test your app, you deploy your app, you want to know how your app is doing. Is it crashing? How do I know analytics? Like, how are people using it? The entire story is covered. You have tools for just about everything, right? So when you come into Xamarin, you're coming into a very rich ecosystem with lots of help from the community, right? So Xamarin is big. And the biggest promise and the biggest selling point for Xamarin is how much you can target, right? So iOS, Android, and UWP are given. Those things are supported. UWP, by the way, opens up your Xamarin apps to run on every Windows device, right? So not just phones or tablets or laptops, but HoloLens or Surface Hub, right? It all runs. Samsung has an operating system called Tizen, right? Xamarin supports Tizen apps. So your Xamarin apps can now run on Samsung watches if they're not Android, or like excuse me, refrigerators or washing machines, like you name it, right? So you really can target a big array of devices and platforms. So what exactly is Xamarin? What are they trying to tell you? Turns out there are two main ways in which you can build Xamarin apps. This is the traditional UI approach. This is what we called Mono Touch or Mono Develop and Mono Android back in the days. It's called Xamarin iOS or Xamarin Android now. So the idea is your app has some business logic as to how it runs and what it does, right, behind the scenes. You abstract all of that into C#, and you share that across all platforms. But you make three different heads, three different UI for each platform, right? And those are native UIs for iOS, Android, and Windows. So the trick here is you do have to know iOS and Android and Windows, and you have to build the UI individually for each platform, right? Now, this still is a big step forward because you're getting to reuse your C# all across, but you do have to build the UI separately. This is what I'm more fond of in the last couple of years. It's been about three and a half years that this has been around. Xamarin.Forms is an abstraction over all of these platform layers, right? So I, as a .NET developer, I don't want to know iOS. I don't like to go into Android. I need to write a UI that is abstracted enough, right? So that's where they're giving you that shared UI abstraction, and that abstraction is through XAML, right? So if you do, and I mean, you can also do entire visual tree in code behind, but if you have done any XAML in WPF or Silverlight or Windows Phone, If you're using Windows Phone, I'm here for hugs, but it's been dead many times over. But if you have done any XAML, this is going to be perfectly, I mean, you'll feel perfectly at home because it is just XAML and all the tooling is exactly the same. So what they're doing is you write XAML, which is common between all platforms. So when you say a button, a list view, or a drop-down, you're writing pure XAML, and at runtime, they will render the corresponding elements on iOS, Android, and Windows. Right? So that's the trick. Now, there's a little bit of price that you pay, but then again, the tooling has again come a long way, so you don't really have to know about individual platforms. Okay, so while we're on this topic, what exactly is fitted for Xamarin iOS, Xamarin Android? I mean, I want to say that go all out Xamarin.Forms, but Xamarin iOS and Android have a really legit use case most times. If you're building games, if you're building apps that are very native and you want to have an experience which is native on each platform, consider Xamarin iOS or Android because you will still get to use C# all across. And then we'll talk about forms embedding. So if you're building Xamarin iOS or Xamarin Android, you can still use Xamarin.Forms, and you can share a little bit of UI across all platforms. So that's Xamarin.Forms embedding. Xamarin.Forms initially started out as a prototyping tool that is abstraction across all platforms, but it has come a long, long way. I actually know folks who are building games with Xamarin.Forms. So it is rich, and there is very little that you cannot do. So if you are building a line of business app, or if you're like PayPal or Facebook or Google, you don't care about individual platform UX all that much. You care about your app and the look and feel, and you want that to be consistent. Xamarin.Forms is perfect for that because you have an abstracted UI, and you want that UI layer to look and feel the same across all platforms. So you get maximum code reuse across all platforms. So with Xamarin.Forms, you can have up to 95, 96% code reuse across all platforms. So single code base, C# XAML, and then you get to dip into native land when you need to, right? So there are things like native embedding. Let's just say iOS has a control that nobody else has, right? And if you want to use that, just go ahead and render that one native control and fall back to just the defaults for Android or Windows if you need to. And we'll talk about custom renderers. So again, just know that when you come into Xamarin, there are a couple of choices. My personal vote would be to start with Xamarin.Forms all the time. And then when you see that you need to go native, you just go native for just the piece that you need, okay? No matter what you do, though, with Xamarin, iOS, Android, or Xamarin.Forms, you are building truly native apps, right? So make no mistake about that. On iOS, you'll do ahead of time compilation and down into true ARM bits for iOS. And then you can do JIT for Android. You can actually turn on ahead of time compilation for Android as well. It makes it super fast. And you're building an APK, right? And C# XAML is kind of given for Windows. It's truly an AppX package. So no matter what you're doing, it is truly a native app. So don't let anyone tell you that it's not native. You're doing some cross compilation. All of that is taken care of before your app runs. So it is truly native. This is one of the things that Microsoft and Xamarin like saying, and it's true. There is nothing that you cannot do from a Xamarin app. In terms of API usage, in terms of what your app does on the device, there is nothing that you cannot do. And most times they have like 0-day support. If iOS 11 comes out, if Android comes out with the newer versions, they have 0-day support for the APIs. So you can invoke those new APIs from C# and XAML, right? And starting 2016, mid-2016, one of the pain points with Xamarin was it was expensive. It was a per developer license, per platform. So it was a little, I mean, we saw the promise, but it was a little hard to get into. But now you literally have no barrier to entry. It is all free, and it's open source. So if you have any version of Visual Studio starting from Visual Studio Community, this stuff is all free for you. And it's open source. You can take a look at what their source code looks like on GitHub. I have built it from source. It's big, but you can actually build Xamarin.Forms from source, and you can tweak things around if you need to, right? So they're accepting lots of pull requests from the community. So if you don't like something, you can change it and make a pull request, okay? So you're coming into a nice, welcoming land of Xamarin. Any questions so far? Okay. Let's look at some stuff here in Visual Studio. We've been talking for a while. All right, so this is Visual Studio for Mac. Visual Studio for Windows is exactly the same experience. Visual Studio is a big installation if you did the whole thing, but in VS 2017, they have this concept of workspaces. So if you have a brand new machine and you're wanting to install Visual Studio on it, on Windows, just choose the Xamarin workspace. And then you'll just get the bits that are for Xamarin. You don't care about ASP.NET or Azure or any of the desktop stuff. So in VS for Mac or VS for Windows, you can start up here. I'll make it a little bigger. And notice how you can do different things. You can do iOS, Android, you can do .NET Core, Mac, tvOS, and you name it. But the basic thing is you go with the Forms app. You can build native iOS or Android if you want. Then you hit Next, and notice how it says Target Platforms. And I can say DevReach, and I can go Next, Next. It's thinking for a second. And now it's done. OK, so let's take a look at what it did for us. Right? There are three things that gave you. So there is an iOS project. There's an Android project. Now, this is a Mac, right? So I cannot do a Windows project on this, this particular solution. But I can take this solution, move it to GitHub or on a jump drive, and move it to my Windows machine, right-click, and add a Windows project, right? The goal is to have these iOS, Android, and Windows projects be as empty as possible. You don't want to have anything in them unless you're going into native stuff. What it does include are like screenshots and launch screens and all the device-specific things that need to be in that app package for that platform. That's what goes in there, right? But otherwise, everything here is in this folder. This is what we called sharing of code. And this has kind of morphed a little bit in the last couple of months and so. This is still a PCL, a portable class library. This is what lets you share code between different platforms. As of about a week or so back, if you grab the latest Xamarin bits, that thing is actually now a .NET Standard library. So you can take that library, you can move it off to ASP.NET, and you can share some code. We'll talk about .NET Standards in a bit, but know that that folder is where you keep your shared code, both your UI and your business logic. Now, there are a couple of things that work well with Xamarin. This is XAML and C# that we're doing, so you can just go straight up with code behind, or you can do some MVVM type frameworks, and they work nicely. You'll notice out of the gate they give you models and views and view models, so that's nice. So let's walk out of this and then show you a little bit more of a realistic solution. All right, so this is an app which, actually I've deleted the Android project, but I can add one back. But everything I have is in this, this solution called Aviation, and this is a common shared project. I used to work for a private aviation company, right? The rich and famous don't fly like you and me. They fly in business jets. They are super shitty for the environment, but they're fun. So if I was making an app for private business jets and so on, how would I go about doing it? First is, for any mobile app, you have to first think about data. Like, what is the data that your app is handling? How do you want to store that? You can store that in the cloud. You can store that in SQL Server under your table. Doesn't matter, as long as the data is accessible through a service, right? Now, for me, that data actually lives in the cloud. Let's close this. And I'm going to go look at platform.telerik.com. This is our cloud. Which is also changing into Kinvey and other backend services. This is my app. And it literally doesn't matter where you keep your cloud, where you keep your data. Could be in Azure, could be in Amazon, could be any other cloud provider. The idea is you will have a RESTful endpoint on top of it. So this is a table. This is my table of all the business jets that my company deals with. And this is my list of the different jets. And there's an image to each jet and so on, right? So that's my data. And I want to get that down into a mobile app. So how do I do this? Everybody will give you an SDK, so you can consume it from JavaScript, from .NET. So we give you an SDK, and it's easily consumed from Xamarin. So let's go back into my app here. So to start off, well, actually, let's run this app, just to kind of give you a feel. I'm running in, I have the latest bits for iOS 11, so I'm going to run this in iPhone X or 10. Anyone ordered the iPhone 10 yet? Some of you? OK. The notch is now infamous. It's going to make web apps super fun. But we'll survive. You can just add like half a dozen Safari-specific meta tags, because like, why not? It's an easy solution. All right, so that's my app, right? It's just pulling a list of business jets that you saw from the cloud down to my app, right? So how do we do this? First is, if you look at my models here, I have a model called BizJets, which is super simple. It's just a representation of the data that I have in the cloud, just in my app. So it's just my business jet. This is kind of going through the iNotify property changed type pattern and abstraction and interface. So it's going to raise an event every time something changes. But essentially, we have three properties. There's a name, there's a capacity, and the URL. That's all. Now, I have a view model here, which does most of the handshaking work between getting the data from the cloud and just passing it on to my view, which is just the client side end, client side of your app. So in my view model, I have a key to my cloud SDK and my service. And then down here is where I actually use that key to go off to cloud and say, get all, and get it asynchronously. So just go off to the cloud endpoint, which is RESTful. I can pull it up on any app in my browser. Go off to that table, get me all the data from that table. That's all there is to it. Once I do get that data back, I'm going to put this in this collection called observable collection of the type business jet. What that does is, it's a C# generic collection, but it is a little fancy. It does two-way data binding, right? So I can bind that collection to my UI, and then if my collection changes, the UI updates itself, and vice versa, right? So that's my collection. I'm bringing the data down, and I'm putting it in that collection. And then in my view, this is XAML that you're looking at. This is the exact same XAML that you will write for other XAML platforms. There are some subtle differences, but it is XAML. It looks a little busy, but there is not much going on. I am using some Telerik UI controls, which we'll talk about, but you get a generic list view from Xamarin as well. So just to kind of maybe show you, let me step out of here for a second. So this is Xamarin.Forms. If you go look at their docs and what they do, they give you this out of the box. So when you're building a Xamarin.Forms app, this is a Xamarin.Forms app. All your pages can be of a couple of different types. You can have a content page, you can have a tabbed page, a carousel page, and so on. And then you get a few layouts as to how you want to render that content out on your mobile app and your pages. So stack layout, grid layout, absolute. Don't do absolute unless you know the exact form factor that you need. And you get maybe like 20 or so controls out of the box. Now remember, all of these controls are abstractions. So when they say time picker or I don't know, list view or a button, they are abstractions. So when you render a list view, they will render a list view natively on iOS, Android, and Windows. Bless you. And then it goes from there on. So you can use this, or you can, we'll talk about some more smarter UI. We kind of help you out so that your users are going to expect some things from your UI, so it helps to kind of have a UI that is nice and polished. So let's go back to Visual Studio. This is a Telerik UI. This is using a list view. And that's all there is to it. There is a data template that displays the image, and then there's a stack layout that displays the aircraft name and capacity. That's all there is to it. And then if you look at my code behind, which is my XAML CS file, all that it's doing is newing up a view model and then saying, hey, go and get all the business jets, and then once I'm done, set the item source of the list view to my collection. That's all there is to it, right? This is like hello world for mobile apps. Get a list from the cloud and display it in your app. Okay? Any questions so far? All right, so that's good. That's step one. Let's look at a few more things that most Xamarin.Forms apps will need, because it's seldom just a single screen. Most mobile apps are a collection of several pages. So how do you go about making up those pages, and how do you navigate between these pages? So if I click on any one of those, you see that I navigated to a different page. The way that works is in your common folder, you have this thing called appstart.cs. This is the first like main.cs for your app. This is where processing begins, right? So this is where the app is getting renewed up, and this app object, you have that app object throughout the lifecycle of your app. And main page is what you new up to say, this is my first page of the app, right? And notice how I'm giving it the home view, which is the first page. It automatically puts it into a navigation stack. There is a navigation built in. It's essentially a LIFO stack, last in, first out. So when I go from page 1 to page 2, it puts page 1 into that stack, and then when I say back, it just pops out page 1, and we're back. But the good thing is, when we are back on this simulator, like this back button, this is customized for iOS, Android, and Windows. So you'll have the same thing. Now, in here, you see a couple of event handlers, right? On start, on sleep, on resume, right? So these are standard events that your app goes through as people are using your app. Start is when your app launches and it starts up. On sleep is when your app was running and the user got distracted and he went off to a different app. But your app is still running in the background, right? So that's on sleep. And then on resume is when your app comes back into the foreground. back in the when the user is actually actively using your app. Do you guys see a thing that's missing, an event that's missing in this list? It's when, like, all of us use a lot of apps throughout our days on our phones, right? And eventually, if you have not used an app for a while, your OS is going to be low. You're just sitting there consuming memory. I'm just going to kill it, right? So you do not get a notification when your app is killed, right? So whatever state you have to save, do it on sleep. So you can maintain that continuity of experience. All right, so let's look at a few more things about real-world apps. So this is where I go off and get the data from the cloud, but you don't want me to doing that on every single time the app runs. You want to be caching the data. There are several things you can do. I'm showing you one of the easiest ways. This application object is what you have access to throughout the app lifecycle, and there is a nice dictionary to it. It's just a name-value pair, and you can stick things into it. This is getting serialized into JSON and getting stored on file for iOS, Android, and Windows. You just don't need to care about it. And then you can bring that collection back from the disk anytime you want. That's one way. There are other ways in which you can store data. There's a settings plugin. You can store it on file. There is SQLite.net. If you are dealing with like massive line of business objects, which are very complicated, and the relationships between them, store them all up in SQLite.net, and they will store it on disk for each platform. All right, so what else can we look at? So when I tap on a business jet, you see what I'm doing here is await, and then navigation.push async, and I'm taking the context of what you clicked on onto the next page, and then I can come back. So this is kind of the standard way in which you do navigation. As you are starting up, this is fine, but one of the downsides of this is your view models are very tied to the actual view. So your business logic is very much tied to UI. So if you want to move away from that, you can do view model to view model navigation. Then you're not quite tied to the UI, and you can do unit testing a little better. MVVM is built into Xamarin.Forms, okay? People confuse that MVVM is the same as MVVM framework. It's not the same. MVVM is a design pattern. You can do MVVM just out of the box in Xamarin.Forms. You can have models, you can have views and view models. Data binding is available, navigation is available. What is not available is some of these, like view model to view model communication, view model selectors, and anytime you do any of this boilerplate code, you can bring in an MVVM framework. But just to get started, this is fine. Now, let me show you a few other things. This here app, this is a list view, and it looks pretty simple, but you can style it anyhow you want. This one being a Telerik list view, it has some features, so I can just like do that. That's pull to refresh, because people expect these things from your modern app. This is where it's going off to the cloud. If you're doing like a news app or a sports app, it can go off and fetch you some fresh data. If you keep scrolling down, eventually you'll get to a point where you're binding it to, oh, that's a crash. That's not nice. Let's refire up that again. Maybe it just sat there for a while. But you can bind your list views to 100,000 records, and it should be nice and fluid as the user is scrolling to it. And while this is coming up, essentially in our list view, what you can do is there's just a simple flag that says pull to refresh enabled. You set that to true, and then you get an event handler as to when the user does pull to refresh, and you can respond to that and go off to your service and bring fresh data back. And then you can also do load on demand. So if you have lots and lots of data, we are careful as to how we bind the data. We don't want to bind the UI to 100,000 records all at the same time, because that will slow it down. So we kind of go in chunks of however the viewable area is, and we'll bind to the next 200 and so on. So let's scroll down again to the bottom. Hopefully it doesn't crash. There you go. So as I scroll down, you see that load on demand coming up. So this is where I can see the user is scrolling, and I can add more things to it as the user is scrolling and bind more things to it. All right, so that's one. Now, let's do a few more fancy things. I mean, if this is a list view, people are going to expect some swipe actions, some swipe gestures. So I can say, I want to fly on this Hawker 800 today. I can swipe here to the right. You see that book. This is kind of standard for like inbox apps. You can right-click or, I mean, left or right swipe, and you can delete things. When I say book, I'm essentially saying, I'm here in Sofia. Get me a plane. So when I come down here, it's going to ask me, OK, where are you at? This is kind of hard-coded, because this is running in the simulator. I think that GPS is just San Francisco, because it's Apple. So I can say yes. And then this is just a form. It looks to be a little bit of a busy UI, but there is not much code that you have to do to render this. So let's take a look at this real quick. So in here, if you notice in my model, I have this thing called a customer, and essentially this customer model is what I'm dealing with. Like when you say, book me a flight, I am dealing with a customer, so he has a name, and I can do some validations on it. Last name, first name, age, and then do you have a lap child, where are you headed, when are you headed, and so on. And then when you look at the view model, all I'm doing is just newing up one sample data. You can just pull it out of your database as you need to. And then if you look at my XAML here, it's really nothing. It's just one rad data form. This is our control so that we can do forms over data really nicely, so you don't have to create all that UI by hand, because all of that is just wired up automatically. In this one here, you'll notice that I'm just getting the selected customer, and then I'm just saying, go bind this to that view, and it just automatically renders all of the objects and properties. And it can do client-side validations to make sure like the name and the age and on inbound, outbound airports, those are all filled in. Now, I showed you a few other like one other thing in there that's interesting, and that's a plugin. So our mobile devices have lots of sensors in them, right? There's a GPS, there's geolocation, there's accelerometer, camera, you name it. So how do you, from a Xamarin app, have access to all of those sensors, right? So the answer is plugins. And the plugins are nice because you can do them from a cross-platform way. I can just write C#, and I don't need to know how iOS or Android does camera. It just is automatically taking care of me. This one here is the geolocation plugin. I'll show you how to get plugins, but just so you know, you can right-click anytime from a Xamarin app, and you can say add NuGet package. This one here is our Telerik NuGet feed, but you can switch to the official NuGet feed. This is the exact same NuGet that you find from any Visual Studio desktop or web app, right? So all of the NuGet packages are available to you. As long as they don't have any platform-specific dependencies, you can bring in anything, because everyone uses Newtonsoft.json, right? So you can bring in these things. You can bring those plugins in from NuGet, or you can go to a gallery, which I'll show you. But essentially, once you do that, you'll notice that in my package references, I do have the geolocator plugin. So with that, I can just reference that plugin, and I can say, geolocator, this is your accuracy, and then go ahead and get me the position, right? And once I fire off that call, I can read the lat long of the user just in my C# code, right? So every plugin is exactly the same. I can just say camera.getPicture, and I don't need to know how iOS or Android does it. I can just expect a picture back, right? There's a plugin for just about everything that you can think of. Sensor-wise, there is nothing you cannot do. Make sense? Yeah? All right, so this is just the basics of Xamarin. Notice how I can come down here. This thing is running. I can come down here and deploy my app to just about any iOS device. And then for Android, Android comes in virtual hard drives, so I can deploy it to any Android virtual hard drive. There's just no easy way sometimes. Android just has a lot of flavors, right? So everybody has a skin for Android, so you can get any of those VHDs, and you can customize them, you can install them, and you can deploy your app directly from Visual Studio onto these things. Now, one question that we get a lot, and maybe we'll cover that once we talk about like some of the tooling and how you do that from Visual Studio. One question we get a lot is, do I need a Mac for iOS development? The answer is yes and no, right? So we'll talk about that. All right, let's keep going. Okay, now you've seen the basics. What you're writing is C#, what you're writing is XAML. And you're comfortable doing that in Visual Studio or any other IDE of your choice. The development tools are exactly the same for WPF, Silverlight, you name it, any XAML platform that you have experience with. So it's a nice, comfortable place that you're coming in with. Here's a list of all the tools that most Xamarin developers end up using. One is Visual Studio IDE choice on Windows. It is a very rich experience. The simulators all work, iOS, Android, and Windows. And I mean, you are coming into Visual Studio, you expect IntelliSense, you expect code navigation and all the richness. It is almost the exact same thing on Mac. So this is VS for Mac. This went GA, like public availability as of like early this year. And it's not as rich as Visual Studio, but it does most of what Visual Studio can do for you, particularly for Xamarin development. For ASP.NET development, for Azure, it's fine, really. App building blocks. Look, how do you actually go and build your app? What are some things you want to pull in? We looked at NuGet. This is the NuGet feed. It's redone a little bit. So NuGet has had a fork in the road, right? So for some time, NuGet was hosting like JavaScript libraries or CSS libraries, which is not what Microsoft wants to do, because the folks who make those libraries don't put them in NuGet. They put them in like Bower or NPM or Yarn or whatever. So NuGet clearly has stepped away from that, and they're saying, we will just host .NET stuff and .NET DLLs. So everything that's in NuGet, you can bring it in. Eventually, so Xamarin right now runs on Mono. Eventually, don't quote me on this, it will be replaced by .NET Core, right? And then NuGet plays an even bigger role, because the pieces of the .NET framework that your app needs to run, NuGet is going to be the one that delivers that and brings that into your app. So NuGet is important. This is the plugins store. This is on GitHub. Just like search for Xamarin components, and you'll end up on this page. This is where you can look through any sensor that you want to use on your phone. And there's a cross-platform implementation of that sensor, so you can do this from your C# app. This is the Xamarin store. This is kind of taking the plugin thing to the next level. Most things here are free, but there are some things that are not free. If you need those like cloud integrations, like you want to integrate with Dropbox or Amazon or whatever, you need a barcode scanner, you come to the component store. And you can get this from Visual Studio, or you can go directly to the store. You can download a zip file, or you can get it from NuGet. However it is, there's a lot of help. So before you start reinventing the wheel, take a good look as to what's around. Deployment. This is where we get a lot of questions about Xamarin. So first is, if you're building iOS app, this is not something that anybody can get you around, because it's an Apple restriction. Apple wants your app package to be built on Xcode that is licensed to the same developer that has the Apple dev account on their app store, right? That's not something anyone can get you around. But once you have that account, you can make life a little easier. If you are on a Mac, like I was, you see all of the iOS options light up. All the different iPads and iPhones light up. If you're on Windows, this is a Windows screenshot, then you need to have a Mac. Because again, the app package needs to be built through Xcode, right? You need to have a Mac somewhere. It's called a Mac agent, and Visual Studio will give you a screen, so you can pair your Visual Studio to a Mac, and then you can hit F5, and it just takes all of your code bits to Xcode, does the build, and comes back with the app package. Most people will have a Mac somewhere on the network. The easiest way is to get a Mac Mini, and it's just like $500, and you just throw it somewhere on your network, and everybody can use it, and that's just all you need, just for Xcode to build your app package. Do you have to have a physical Mac? No. There are services called macinthecloud.com, so you can buy a Mac by the hour, and you can provision a nice VM, and you can push off you can actually wire a Visual Studio directly to the cloud Mac, and you can just do the build and come back to you, right? And that's just a simulator. Once you have Xcode going, you have access to all of the iOS simulators, which are nice. Now, this is new. This is called the Windows iOS simulator. When you have a Mac that's doing the build, it will automatically fire up the simulator for you once it's done, and it's going to deploy your app to the iOS simulator. You always have to kind of go look at the Mac side of things and see how your app is running. You don't have to do that anymore. There's the Windows iOS simulator, which is essentially just a shim. It streams exactly what your iOS simulator is showing on the Mac side of things, right? It's just exactly the same simulator, just on your Windows, so you don't have to look away from Visual Studio. The big advantage of this is on Windows, right? And Windows have touch devices, or touch screens. Macs will likely never have touch, and I don't want them to have touch. But this one you can open this up on a Surface Book or a Surface, and you can pinch and zoom around. If you are dealing with a map and so on, you can actually interact with your app just the way your users will. So this is nice. And you don't have to look away from Visual Studio. Yes, I'm sorry to say that. But you do need VS Enterprise to run this. There are other features, like there's a live unit testing thing that Visual Studio has, which also needs VS Enterprise. So yes, sorry about that. What's that? I have not. OK, all right. All right, good. OK, so Android, again, no easy way. There are lots of Android simulators and emulators. They all come in VHDs. Visual Studio will give you some Android emulators or simulators out of the box. This is the Android simulator. This one is still slow. Even with like some of the Haxum virtualization, it is still slow. But you can get access to all of the Android bits right from Visual Studio. Interestingly enough, one of the best Android simulators, you can use Genymotion and other Android guys, but this is Visual Studio Android Simulator. It is fast. It is nice. And you get that out of the box in VS 2017 if you're picking the Xamarin workflow, or you can still install it on top of VS 2015. But this is a native Android simulator that's running on your Windows machine. So don't update it. OK, so Yes. So essentially, what he's referring to is it's a very real problem for Xamarin development because there are lots of moving pieces to this, right? You're dealing with iOS, Android, and Windows. You want to make sure things are in sync because if they're not in sync, your code will not deploy to the simulator because your versions don't match up and so on. So yes, keep them in sync. Once you have a stable thing, just code and then update everything all in one go. Yes. Yes. Okay, this thing is sort of new. It is still in beta, but it's coming along nicely, and this is something I'm quite excited about. This is a Xamarin Live Player, because Android is a little bit of a Wild West. It doesn't take much to deploy your app to, I'm stepping on this wire. Okay, I shouldn't do that. Android, it's easy to deploy your app to the device. iOS, not so much, because you have to have an Apple Dev account, you have to have a profile on your phone, and you have to unlock your phone. Then you can wire up a USB and deploy, which is hard. So they're trying to get you around that. There's a Xamarin Live Player app on iOS and Android stores. You can get the app, and then you have to have the alpha and beta bits for Visual Studio on Mac and or Mac or Windows. And then you can just pair your app, your actual physical device, to that QR code in Visual Studio, and then you can hit F5 and deploy wirelessly to your device. Keep in mind, it is running inside of a shell. It's not truly a native run, but for most things, it gets you around and gets you a nice starting point. Okay, cloud. Mobile apps don't live in a silo. You don't want your data to be just on the device, because I'm going to switch devices throughout my day. You want a continuity of experience. So use the cloud however you want to use the cloud. If you want to use Azure, there are lots of things for you in Azure. That's the thing that you'll most likely use, Azure mobile apps. It's part of their app service, and it does most of the things that you expect. So there's this whole concept of backend as a service. And yes, you can host your data and have a service by itself, but some of the things that BAS services do are just hard to replicate. Things like push notifications. And you want push notifications to work across the globe, and you want to have elastic scalability, so those things are hard to do. Authentication. Don't let me type another username and password on your app. Just use any of the social authentication providers so you can sign people in. Now, there are other services. There is a SQL database if you want to just store your relational data in the cloud. You can also store your non-relational data in table storage and so on. And then there is this whole thing called functions. Azure has have their lambdas. It's all like the whole serverless thing. I heard people saying like it's literally serverless. Like no, it's not literally. There is a server. You just don't own the VM. You're writing event-driven programming that's responding to stuff that's. I mean, it's code that's in the cloud that's responding to some events. So there are lots of things you can use in Azure. This thing is kind of built in VS for Mac and VS for Windows. When you create a new Xamarin app, you get that checkbox. Right? So what they're trying to say is, it looks like you are building a mobile app, you are going to need some data, let's help you out. When you check that checkbox, they give you an ASP.NET Web API project out of the box, and they just put it in your solution. What that is simple, just some data, and it's exposed over a RESTful service, and it's just a Web API call. And you can right-click and say, go deploy to Azure. But out of the box, it's already wired up, so your Xamarin app is using the data that comes out of that service, right? So your service can just provide the data right out of the box inside of Visual Studio. It's a nice way to kind of start playing. But again, Azure isn't the only option. Amazon has their mobile hub, lots of SDKs to integrate with Xamarin. And then we have Kinvey, which is our backend as a service offering. Again, it is really cross-platform, works with just about any client-side technology you can think of. And we don't hold you back. You can host this on Azure, Amazon, or Google. It's just a lightweight, platform-independent BAS. Okay, code reusability. Let's talk a little bit about this. .NET Standard, this is big. And this is one of the reasons why like people say, why should I upgrade to .NET Standard when I already have .NET Full Framework going? Like .NET Core from .NET Full Framework. This is the reason why, because this is new, and it's at .NET Standard 2.0 right now. This one is replacing what we call PCLs. With PCLs, when you said File New Project PCL, you chose platforms to target, right? The more you chose, the lesser APIs you got. This is kind of putting the onus back on the .NET framework. So when I say my library targets .NET Standard 1.x, I am assured, it's essentially a spec, it's a list of APIs. Then I'm assured a list of APIs on every .NET that is supporting this .NET Standard, right? So be it .NET Framework, be it .NET Core, be it .NET for Unity, it all supports that one single .NET Standard. So I have code portability from my Xamarin app, if I have some business logic, I would want to put that as a .NET standard, make it a separate library, so I can use it from ASP.NET or WPF or WinForms, right? So that's the advantage. That's what you get from this portability side of things. And then this thing is also new. It is not ready yet. It will be ready by the end of next year, hopefully. Turns out nobody at Microsoft really owned XAML. XAML is just a UI spec, right? So when platforms came up, they did their own little things with XAML. It's all about interpretation and how the UI is rendered. So it turns out there's multiple XAML dialects for each platform. If you just take XAML.Forms or Xamarin.Forms and then UWP, you have these differences. Like Xamarin.Forms will call that a label. UWP calls it a text block versus entry or text box, or stack layout versus stack panel. It's just frustrating, these little differences. So they're trying to combine all of this into a single standard. So all of these XAML frameworks speak the same language. UWP and Xamarin.Forms, that's not very hard to do. It's just these little differences. The moment that you bring in WPF, that just kind of opens up the can of worms, because WPF XAML is very rich, and it's been around for a long time, but they're trying. They're trying to have a common dialect so that you can create a piece of XAML UI that you can take from Xamarin.Forms to UWP and WPF. So it's coming. OK, app templates. We talked a little bit about MVVM. Again, MVVM is built in inside Xamarin.Forms. Whenever you find yourself doing those like service locator patterns and view model to view model navigation, that's when you want to bring in an MVVM framework. They are really helpful if you're working in a team and you're building a complex app. They're not so helpful if you're just starting out with Xamarin.Forms. Okay, I've seen people kind of trip up on hackathons where they try bringing an MVVM framework out of the box. So these are optional things for you to use, but if you are going to use them, that's MVVM Lite, this is MVVM Cross, that's Prism. All of those MVVM frameworks that you have been used to from XAML platform days, they all work in Xamarin.Forms. And they all have nice app templates. If you are using UI, I'm obviously biased. Like, we will give you nice Visual Studio templates to kind of help you get started, so you have the UI out of the box. Network utilities. We have Mr. Eric Lawrence right here. He did a Fiddler talk. We have another Fiddler talk coming up, but Fiddler is still great, because when you are building a mobile app, you're making those service calls, you want to know what's going on under the covers. You want to know what is failing, and you don't want to be in the dark. So use Fiddler. This is Postman from Google, also great for APIs, lets you test. And by APIs, these are like your CRUD operations, your create, read, update, deletes. Make sure those all work before you start integrating them in your app. I use this a lot. It's Reflected 2. It's a way of streaming what your phone is showing on a bigger screen. It's great for demos, because you can just like show your live screen. It's just your device and your computer just needs to be on the same Wi-Fi, and then we can talk and we can share screens. OK, DevOps. Like I said, there are several lifecycle stages as to what your app goes through, and you want to have the right tools. There were several options, but I think Microsoft is just trying to combine everything. And there are other providers. Like, we'll help you out a little bit as well from Progress side. There are other providers who do that. This is where Microsoft wants you to be. Visual Studio Mobile Center. They're combining a few of their services into one, so you can do your testing. You can do your deployment. Maybe you're writing a line of business app. Maybe you don't want to put that in the store. So this is a way to deploy it within your enterprise, and then you can get crash reports and analytics on how it's behaving. This is something I'm really fond of, Device Test Cloud. This is still a Xamarin service, but they're kind of integrating this inside of Visual Studio Mobile Center. If you are building a real-world Xamarin app that you're going to use, that you're going to have users all over the world, it is impossible to test your device or test your app on every single device. Like, just for Android, there are just so many devices. So out in Boston and a few other places where they have servers, Xamarin actually has more than 2,000 real devices that they have running on a lab. They can take your test code. This is not free, by the way. It is part of the enterprise suite. But they can take your code, and they can deploy it to real devices and give you screenshots and analytics on those edge cases where your app is failing on like some weird Android device. And app analytics, they'll show you how your people are using their apps and what kind of usage you get, navigation and screens, and how they're being used. They're nice. OK, now UI. Granted, there are a few other UI providers, but we will try to help you out. You guys possibly heard of DevCraft, which is our complete .NET bundle for web, desktop, mobile. For Xamarin, this is something we are really passionate about now. We want to help you out so that you are shipping your apps with the best possible UI. It works with Xamarin iOS, Android, as well as Xamarin.Forms. It works with Windows or Mac, however you want it. And this is just the complex UI that you don't want to create by hand. I'll give you some examples. And you don't have to take my word. There's a sample app in store for iOS, Android. Just go play with it. Some examples of things that are really hard to do for Xamarin apps. We are known for charts and graphs, so a dozen charts and graphs, very interactive, very visual, pan and zoom, selections, annotations, legends, you name it, we can do it all. List view, this is something I'm very fond of because the Xamarin list view, the one that's out of the box, isn't very feature-rich. You want that pull to refresh, you want that virtualization, you want selections and swipe gestures and all of that, it's built in. And it has multiple layouts, like for tablets and phones. Data form, I showed you a little bit of the data form. If you have any forms over data and you need client-side validations, don't sit there, just reinvent and create each of the UI by hand. We can do it all. There are several types of editors based on the properties that your object has, and we can render them all. Side drawers, this is kind of standard for, oh, I didn't show you this in my app. Let's see if this thing is still running. Let's see. I may have killed it, so let's see if I can deploy this one more time. Just going to show you what this does. And I have 4 minutes left. OK, so when I swipe over from the right, you see that? This is a very standard way of putting away your app's navigation or your context menu, your user settings, whatever you name it. It's just a placeholder. You can put whatever you want in it. It's just a nice way of tucking in some app navigation so that your app is uncluttered. So from here, I can go to this one here. It's bound to the same list of business jets, so I can find the planes that I'm looking for. Notice how I'm giving you like suggestions. That's autocomplete, so please don't make me type a whole lot on my phone. So I'm going to pick the Gulfstream, and this one is like a little gauge that shows you the max speed. And then I can look at some supersonic jets. Yeah. I'm a bit of an aviation enthusiast, and the only commercial aviation ever that flew supersonic was the Concorde, which was the British Airways and Air France collaboration. It wasn't very good for the environment. It was pricey, but they have solved the problem of that whole sonic boom thing. Like when you cross the barrier of sound, which is about 720 miles per hour, you get that whole sonic boom because the air just cannot travel around your plane. It just comes out as a boom from the back of the aircraft. They have solved it to a point where it's almost, like it's not, you can still hear it, but it's not as bad for the environment. The Concorde only did it over the Atlantic. But take my word, within the next 10, 15 years, you should have, if not commercial, at least private aviation back in the supersonic speed realm. These are some of the most famous like supersonic military jets, because military doesn't care. They can do it all. So some of the Sukhois, some of the MiG-25s and SR-71, that's one of the most famous supersonic jets, the SR-71 Blackbird. Flies at over like 90,000 feet. And at that point, you can like see all of United States, and yeah, it's fast. So that's just the side drawer. Let's go back. So again, nice way of kind of tucking away your content, and you can have different types of effects and transitions. Calendar, every user needs to see things on their calendar. We can give you a nice calendar to kind of integrate with your app, and looks the same as your modern calendar. And then these are gauges, linear gauges, radial gauges, which are, again, really difficult to create by hand. You can customize the heck out of them, be it colors, be it however you want to render. We'll give you all of that. Tab view. Tab views sound a little easy. I showed you a little bit of a tab view in the app, but that's just what is built in. It's not very polished. You can have a tab view from us, which is really polished and catering to each platform. So iOS shows up on the top, or I'm sorry, at the bottom, and then Android shows up on the top. So it's really a polished tab view. This is a segmented UI, so it's like 3 buttons. It's sort of an iOS-specific thing, but it works, and it's a good UI. Autocomplete, again, we can have single autocomplete suggestion, or you can have multiple elements being selected, like on this one. Again, don't make me type a whole lot on my phone. Busy indicators, one of the best suggestions I heard from a UX person was, don't make the user wait on something that he has not asked for. Okay, so if your app is doing something busy, you're going after a service and you're pulling some data back, show something on screen that you're doing something, right? So otherwise, I'm going to try to fiddle with your app and realize it's not responding. So we give you lots of animations to kind of get started. These are things you can customize, and you can build your own custom animations as well on top of your own UI. Rating controls, again, these are things that you think would be out of the box in Xamarin, but again, Xamarin is kind of stepping back and letting the community and letting us do some of these UI things because they want to take care of the .NET side of the core part of things. So different types of shapes as you do ratings and so on. Data grid, this was something I was kind of nervous about because I don't like seeing a lot of grid on my mobile device. It's a small device, but if you're building a line of business app, you do need a grid. And this is what a grid should be. It's got sorting, filtering, grouping, all of that kind of built in, and it's virtualized, it's super fast. So if you're building a line of business app, take a look. And we have things like that'll let you draw shapes. The slide view is nice. It lets you create like a wizard. So if you have like 4 or 5 screens that you want to just let the user go through as a part of a process, use the slide view. So what I'm trying to tell you is there's some help. This is an app that we just made. It's called Telerik Tag It, and it uses some of the UI. It uses Azure as a backend. Again, use the cloud to make your apps more intelligent. This is using cognitive services, and it's using some tagging features. There's language services. There's a ton of services from Azure and Amazon and us that make your apps intelligent. So use those things. This one is open source, so you can go and get all the code for it. If you are into Xamarin and if you want to get started and make yourself comfortable, use the Xamarin University. This is their way of saying, we know that you know. They have really nice coursework. Some of it is a little dated, but it's still, the fundamentals are still there, and you can get certified as a Xamarin developer. That tells your employers and your colleagues that you know Xamarin. Okay? So I'm right at 10:29. I'm going to stop here. Do you guys have any questions, any concerns, any things you like, any things you don't like? Do you guys see the promise of what Xamarin is? They're trying to open up cross-platform mobile dev for every .NET developer, right? So that's the whole promise of Xamarin. Now, I will be around in this room, outside in our booth. Again, ping me here on Twitter or any other thing, any other social media. We do have a feedback survey for all speakers. So again, if you want to go to that URL and just give me some feedback on how I did. And then we'll be around all day. We'll do 10:30 product little demo at our booth. But again, when you're coming into Xamarin, just understand that you're coming into a rich ecosystem where there are lots of tools for Windows, for Mac, and the ecosystem keeps getting better. You have all the plugins, which are open source. You have all the UI that you need. You have all the cloud services that you need. So the tools for Xamarin Dev have come a long, long way. It's just up to you to go build your dream app now. Okay? So that's all from me. Hope you enjoy the rest of the day, and thank you so much for coming out.